Well, today I'm going to talk about life in the gray zone, or the economics of alliances. First of all, I have to get my stopwatch going because I have to know how long this is going to last. Who am I? Well, I'm David Broach. I'm a strategist, the career of which nobody can explain to their children, and I don't have a military number. But that's all you'll get out of me. I want to first of all define gray zone. The gray zone is a state of hostility between various countries which falls short of the state of war. So, for instance, blowing up a North Sea pipeline is gray zone. Actually, shelling and killing a tank is not gray zone, it's warfare. So gray zone is anything below that level. Secondly, I want to explain a word I shall be using a lot in the economics of alliances, which is what is defined for the purposes of today an alliance. And it is an agreement between states that an attack on one is an attack on all. Now, let me define and talk about the gray zone for a minute. That is really a question of saying what the new world global disorder is. And it is, of course, an alliance of democratic states, principally in NATO, but not all, which are up against an alliance of totalitarian states led by China, with Russia pretending that it's up there, but it isn't. And around this, there is what we call the N factor, which includes the global south, 50% of the world's population, of states which will not be joining probably either the Democratic Alliance or the Totalitarian Alliance. Now, why won't they be joining? First is colonial history and Russian aid in the struggle for independence. Second is the failures of capitalism. In other words, to include them, and they point to the climate catastrophe, inequality of globalization in principle, and COVID care. And the last is the neatness of China's autocratic socioeconomic model. Most N factor states are not true democracies, so China is a neat model to follow. The two major alliances are always dominated by a hegemon, in this case, the US and China. The autocratic alliance is glued together by power projection and economic ties of a subjugated nature, which actually is what imperialism used to do. The Democratic Alliance has all of that, but it shares values and it has a common threat dependence. If you think of it as like a triangle, the hegemon is at the top and the members of the alliance are spread out below. The N factor are really like molecules or atoms or subatomic atoms swirling in the surrounding space, aligning themselves with one or the other of the hegemonic alliances, depending on what they see as their advantage. Now we turn to the economics of alliances. The taller and wider the base of an alliance, the more the cost of war is reduced to the hegemon. For example, the US has spent so far 7 to 8% of 1 year's defense budget to wipe out 50% of Russia's military assets, both human and hard asset. Secondly, if NATO fully mobilized, the US would supply 50% of the military asset and the boots on the ground of the NATO alliance. If it was alone, it would supply 100%. Second, the more trade is done within the alliance than outside the alliance, the greater capital flows are within the alliance. And the deeper the alliance, the greater the currency of the hegemon at the top of the alliance is used as an international reserve within that alliance. In general, to put it in a more simple term, alliance members hold 30% more of a hegemon's currency than normal trade would dictate. Of course, the higher, deeper, wider the alliance, the more complex is policy decision-making and implementation. But just to give you a neat example of this, over 50% of the holdings of safe US dollar assets are held by governments that are in US alliances. These are called mutual defense treaties. The figure rises to 75% if you include countries which have agreements on military cooperation with the United States. All of this means that as the world splits into alliances, globalization is over and deglobalization is the new reality. Friendshoring, onshoring, etc. This is all very nice, but in economic terms, it incurs costs and loss of productivity. The ECB study shows that full onshoring would involve a permanent drop in international trade of 19-20%. The global GDP will be reduced by 5%, and then inflation would rise by between 1% and 4% per annum. The size of government, having been boosted by COVID and kindness, is now being boosted by hostility and military spending. This is significant because only half of COVID stimulus will be reversed by 2025 in OECD economies. And a further 2.5% of government spending will be added through defense spending. Finally, global elasticity of supply is reduced by deglobalization. Inflation and monetary policy become more difficult. The central bank must stick to inflation targets. Fiscal authorities must target domestic supply bottlenecks. That's asking a lot. At the margin, this means free market allocation of resources is on the back burner. Now, let us look at some themes that come out of this. The first theme concerns the US dollar. It currently accounts for 60% of global reserves. It will fall well below 50% within the next 5 years. Now, why is this? Well, first you have to answer the question, why is the dollar the global reserve currency of the world? The US citizens were never asked to vote on the matter. It is because the US dollar has critical mass in terms of economy, trade, and capital flows, including a current account deficit, which keeps international markets well supplied with dollars. It has the rule of law and robust institutions and deep and open capital markets. And finally, it has a convertible currency with an adequate supply of risk-free sovereign bonds. That apparently is how you get to be a global reserve currency. But these are actually post hoc justifications. They come from looking at the dollar and saying, oh, well, it's the global reserve currency. Why is it the global reserve currency? And because it has these qualities, then these become the sine qua non of being a global reserve currency. Let us pit against that view the view that China has every reason to dethrone the US dollar. The risk of having its own US dollar assets seized or frozen in case of conflict, just as Russia's were. And don't forget that China's reserve assets, which are parked in SOEs and in state banks, as well as in institutions abroad, are far higher than the official estimates of $3 trillion. We put them at $4.7 trillion. Secondly, China's aim of global dominance needs a dominant currency. And third of all, the spread of China's political influence to the global south and bilateral nations needs to get the dollar out of the way, out of the equation. Surprisingly, the PBOC has been successful in internationalization of the RMB, and about 1/3 of trade outside China's borders is now conducted in RMB. Why? Because China has been successful in replacing several of its natural constraints, such as liquidity and legality, with bilateral swaps to back RMB trade and RMB deals outside of the reach of the domestic politics of China. Now, how could China go further? The renminbi is one way they're trying to do it, though it's only 0.13% of broad money supply at the moment, and that's after 5 years of operation. Well, China's path forward is simply going to be to redominate global trade within its alliance in RMB and in bilateral deals. It's done it with Saudi Arabia, it's doing it with Brazil, and the pattern will persist. Now let's do some simple arithmetic. If all the nations outside the Democratic Alliance were to switch to invoicing in RMB, and if you add a 20% reduction in China's holdings of US dollars, and assume that Hong Kong repegs the Hong Kong dollar to the RMB, then you have a 20% fall in the share of US dollars in global trade and international reserves. The US would now account for something around 40% of global reserves. That would be an enormous victory for China, even if the US dollar remained the single biggest reserve currency when it was all over. My view is you want to think about two things about the dollar. One is how successful China is in this course. And two is it offset by the increased demand for dollars by the member states of the US-led Democratic Alliance? Passing on, there will be war with Taiwan. The reason is that Xi Jinping puts ideology before economics. And he is a man who does what he says and says what he does. And he has always said that within his term of office, he would finish the Taiwanese question, if necessary, by military force. We have to think about this. The result, of course, that we will step in to support Taiwan. The result is not a Russian embargo. Russia successfully turned EU into a Russian energy pawn, which it escaped from over the last year. But the global economy is rather like a giant Apple Inc., with 30% of its output made in China and 20% consumed in China. That's an exaggeration. But it serves to make a point. There has been little so far creative work done on how, given a war for Taiwan, we weaponize the full range of economic ties with China and Taiwan, including TSMC, so that China is the big loser, though we all lose. Double-digit losses on GDP would be the benchmark, but we need to make sure that China's loss is 30%, so that economic collapse makes a continuation of war impossible and promotes regime change. Now to the elephant in the room, the war in Ukraine. And note, much of what I've said is not about Ukraine. It is about democratic versus the totalitarian alliances and the economics of those alliances. But now to Ukraine. We have armed Ukraine not to lose the war. But we have not armed Ukraine to win the war. We asked Ukrainian soldiers to fight and die in a way we would never ask of our own. The gap in hardware, both land, sea, and air, and manpower, is still markedly in favor of Russia, even if the motivation and efficiency of its fighting forces are less. The war will go on. Russia has the resources for that for at least another 24 to 36 months. Ultimately, the costs and losses will undermine Putin, first gradually, then suddenly, like Hemingway's description of the process of going bankrupt. But his replacement will not be democratic, and the process is a fight for pie among gangsters. There is likely to be both escalation and fragmentation within Russia. Fear of this outcome makes arming Ukraine a gradual business, small steps on the escalation ladder. In a moment, I will explain why we are approaching a level of escalation where further steps entail the following. First, a 25% probability of nuclear weapons being used, and a higher probability of the use of chemical weapons. Second, a 50% probability of an Article 5 conflict with NATO, and a 50% probability of Ukraine ultimately winning outright, but not more. So it still is the flip of a coin. The immediate issue of the Black Sea explains some of this. Putin's strategy not to renew the Black Sea grain deal. He believes he can split the EU on the issue of Ukrainian grain exports. So far, he has been proven dead right. The Poles are at the throats of the Ukrainians at the throat of the Italians and lots of other states. Because if they cannot export the grain by the Black Sea, probably 30, 40 million tons of it this year, then a goodly proportion of it will end up in European markets because the infrastructure is not in place to allow those grains to transit the EU and that end up in global markets, having been shipped from EU ports. That will take another year. But Putin, seeing that this splits Europe more successfully than anything else he has done, will go on escalating in the new theater of war, the Black Sea. Now, how does the West react? We can do a reflagging exercise like in the Straits of Hormuz in the 1980s, when, say, Kuwaiti tankers were under threat of attack from Iran. So we have Ernest Will model reflagging of ships and convoys, which are technically feasible, and where the assets to guard them are already in place, both in the form of the 5th and 6th US fleets, and the Turkish Navy is bigger than what Putin has in the Black Sea. But then suppose the next step is that Russia sinks a NATO membership, merchant or naval. That is a NATO Clause 5 event, which theoretically makes feasible that NATO is now at war with Russia. Are we ready for this? The arming of Ukraine, step by slow step over the last 1.5 years, makes me think that we are not ready, that we do not want to be confronted with an escalation which will force us to take a step which will put NATO directly at war with Russia. There is really no investment conclusion. this was not an investment strategy presentation, because you can make that better than me. Thank you.